He didn't speak when they turned him away. He just sat in the rain, reading the same book that had once saved him. But someone saw him, someone who remembered what it felt like to be quiet and overlooked. That moment changed everything, not just for him, but for generations of kids who would come after. What started as one boy with a book became a sanctuary for every unheard voice. This is the story of Milo and the corner that never stopped listening. The bookstore windows were fogged when Milo pressed his face to the glass. His breath drew soft clouds on the pane, eyes scanning the inside for signs of movement, any flicker of welcome. The lights were warm, casting golden halos over shelves stacked high with stories, and people lined the aisles like a living river. Signs hung from the ceiling in deep blue font. Author signing, today only. Meet Astrid Vale, 2 p.m., 4 p.m. It was 3:38 p.m. Milo's shoes were soaked. The soles, worn thin from too many walks to the library, squelched faintly when he shifted on the welcome mat outside the shop. He wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big and held a hardcover against his chest, the corners frayed, dust jacket taped. It was her first book. He had read it 7 times. He pulled open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit him instantly. So did the sound, laughter, the murmur of excitement, and the rustle of shopping bags. The line curled through the store, snaking past display tables piled high with Astrid's newest release. She sat near the back, behind a small wooden desk, her signature looping across book after book like a practiced dance. She smiled at each person, asked their name, sometimes paused for a photo. Milo stood just past the doorway, not moving. His fingers tightened on the book. The line was too long. His bus would leave soon. He looked down, heart racing. Then he took a small step forward. A woman near the register noticed him. She wore a black lanyard with a store badge clipped to her chest. Her eyes scanned him once, then again slower. "You here for the signing?" she asked, voice clipped. Milo nodded. "Where's your ticket?" He opened his mouth, closed it, shook his head. The woman frowned. "We're at capacity. No ticket, no entry." "But," he whispered. She was already turning away. "I'm sorry, you'll have to leave." He didn't move. Another customer stepped around him, brushing past with a glance and a half-smile that didn't reach their eyes. The woman looked back. "You're blocking the door." Milo nodded. The book pressed tighter to his chest. He turned. The door chimed behind him as he stepped back into the cold. He stood on the sidewalk, unmoving. Cars passed, their tires hissing against wet asphalt. The wind picked up, lifting the edge of his hood. He looked down at the book, then back at the window. Inside, Astrid Vale was still signing. Milo didn't cry. He walked to the corner, sat down on the curb beneath a flickering street lamp, and opened the book. He didn't have much time before the bus came, but he could read a little, just a chapter, maybe 2. He turned to page 1, the same place he always started when everything else felt too loud. He didn't know that someone had seen him, didn't know that a man standing near the coffee station had noticed the interaction. The way the boy had stepped in, then stepped back. The way he'd clutched that book like it was more than paper. The man didn't work for the store. He wasn't even there for the signing. But he'd recognized the look in Milo's eyes. He had worn it himself once at a different age, outside a different door. He pulled out his phone. He knew someone who might care. Inside, Astrid Vale reached for the next book. Her hand hovered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Another signature. Another photo. Another name carefully written. It buzzed again and again. She excused herself briefly, stepped behind the curtain into the staff hallway and checked her phone. One message, one photo. A boy sitting on a curb in the rain, reading her book. The text underneath it, they turned him away. She stared at the image for a long time. Then she looked at the clock, 3:56 p.m. She grabbed her coat, stepped out from behind the curtain, raised both hands. "I'm so sorry," she said to the crowd. "That's the last one for today." There were groans, confusion, protest. She bowed her head. "I know, and I promise I'll come back. But there's someone I need to see." She turned and left through the front door. Milo was still reading. He didn't hear the footsteps, didn't look up when the door swung open. But he heard the voice, soft, unsure. "Hi." He blinked, lifted his head. She was standing there, coat unbuttoned, hair curled slightly at the ends, a copy of her own book tucked under one arm. Astrid Vale, the woman whose words had carried him through every lunchroom he'd sat alone in, every quiet night when the world was too big, every time he'd needed to believe that a quiet boy could still be the hero of the story. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. She sat beside him, on the curb, didn't ask his name right away, just smiled. "Is it your favorite part?" she asked, nodding to the open book. He nodded slowly. "I love that chapter too," she said. He looked down. The page was shaking in his hands. She held out her copy. "This was yours," she said. "I saved it for last." She placed it in his lap, signed in silver ink. "To the quiet ones who keep going, you were never invisible to me, Astrid." He stared at the words, and for the first time, Milo smiled. It wasn't big, wasn't loud, but it was real. She stood to leave, then paused. "Thank you for reading." And then she was gone. But her words stayed, and so did his smile. And the book? He never let go of it again. Milo stayed on the curb long after Astrid left. The silver ink glinted faintly in the low light, and the pages in his lap no longer trembled. The warmth of her presence lingered like steam on glass, fragile but comforting. People passed by. A few glanced at him. One woman offered him a tissue without saying a word. He took it, nodded once, and tucked it in the back of the book like a bookmark. When the bus finally came, he climbed aboard with the book cradled in his arms, not tucked in his backpack as it usually was. He sat by the window, watching the city roll past, the bookstores and coffee shops and people with umbrellas. He imagined what it would be like to someday walk back into that same store, not as the boy turned away, but as someone people recognized, someone who wasn't asked to leave, someone who didn't have to explain why he belonged. At home, he laid the book on his desk and sat staring at it for a long time. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he picked up a pencil and turned to a blank sheet of paper. Slowly, carefully, he began to write. Not a story exactly, just a sentence, a memory, a line that had been living in his chest for months. Sometimes the quiet ones don't speak because they're still writing their first words inside. He paused, then added another and another. It wasn't perfect. The grammar was messy. The story skipped around, but it was his. He wrote until the sun began to rise. At school the next day, no one said anything about the bookstore. No one knew. He didn't tell them. He kept the moment folded quietly inside him, like a secret. But something about the way he walked had changed. Not taller exactly, not louder, just more rooted. Like someone had whispered to the soil under his feet, "You can grow here." In the weeks that followed, he kept writing. Sometimes in class, sometimes in the library, sometimes at the bus stop on receipts and scraps of paper. He started carrying a little notebook, thin and spiral-bound, with a blue sticker on the front, a small star, and a single word, "Speak." He didn't show it to anyone, not yet, but every word he wrote was a kind of quiet shouting, a declaration not to the world, but to himself, "I am here." And then, one day, he received a letter. No stamp, no return address, just tucked into his locker, like a note passed between classes. It read, "Dear Milo, I never told you thank you. That day outside the bookstore, when you were sitting in the rain with my book in your hands, I saw you. Not just your face, I saw your heart. I don't know what you've carried or what you're still learning how to say. But I want you to know, That moment, for me, was louder than any applause I've ever gotten. You reminded me why I write. You reminded me who I write for. I hope you're writing too. Even if no one reads it yet, they will. And when they do, I'll be the first in line to buy your book. Keep going. Love, Astrid. Milo read it 4 times before folding it up and placing it gently between the pages of his notebook. That night, he wrote 5 new pages. By spring, he had a story. Not long, just 8 pages. About a boy who lived in a city full of noise, who found a book that whispered instead of shouted, and how that book led him to someone who saw him when no one else had. He didn't plan to share it, but he did. His English teacher asked him to read it aloud. He said no, then yes, then no again. Then the next day he walked to the front of the class, pulled the pages from his notebook, and started reading. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. When he finished, no one laughed. No one whispered. They just looked at him, eyes soft, listening. And in that space between silence and applause, Milo felt something lift off his chest. He had spoken. The story was his. But now it lived in other people too. After class, his teacher slipped him a card. On the front, a photo of Astrid Vale's newest release. On the back, an invitation. Young Author, Showcase, Saturday, 2 p.m., Main Street Bookshop. Milo stood outside the same bookstore he had once been turned away from, wearing the same too-big hoodie, the same frayed sneakers, the same cautious eyes. But this time, someone held the door open for him. And inside, under soft lights and surrounded by stories, he stood at a folding table with a single copy of his manuscript and a tiny sign that said, Author, Milo Hart. The Whisper Book. A woman in a long blue coat was the first to approach. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't have to. She just picked up the story, turned the first page, and said, I've been waiting for this. And Milo, the quiet boy, the one who had once been asked to leave, looked at her and said, So have I. Milo stayed long after the last visitor had gone. The bookstore was quieter now, with only the low buzz of the lights and the occasional creak of a wooden shelf settling into stillness. His little table, once surrounded by strangers, was now just a folding surface with a few smudges of thumbprints and an empty paper cup where someone had left their cocoa. His manuscript, 8 pages stapled at the corner, was still there, though he'd printed 15 copies for the event. Every last one had been taken. He sat in the chair behind the table, his knees pulled up, arms resting loosely across them, and watched as one of the staff members dimmed the overhead lights. She glanced his way, smiling softly, then turned back to organizing the front display. He didn't want to leave yet. He didn't want to step out of the warmth of this space, out into the chill of evening, into a world where his name didn't sit on tables or draw lines of people who waited patiently to hear what a quiet boy had to say. A tap on the glass made him look up. Outside, pressed against the window, were 3 kids, middle schoolers maybe. One of them held up a copy of his story, waving it gently, then pointed to the cover and gave him a thumbs up. They didn't come in. They didn't need to. Milo just pressed his hand to the glass, nodding once. He hadn't spoken much that day. Just a handful of soft greetings, a few thank yous, a quiet explanation when someone asked, "What made you write this?" His answer was always the same. I wanted to speak without having to shout. He'd written that line down on a post-it when he got home, tucked it into the margin of his notebook, and stared at it for a long time. At school the next Monday, something shifted. People who used to pass him in the hallway without a glance now nodded. Someone tapped his shoulder in the library and whispered, "I liked your story." Even the math teacher, Mr. Sanders, the one who never smiled, left a small note on his desk. Your sentences held more truth than some textbooks. He didn't say much in return, just nodded, just kept writing. The local newspaper reached out. A reporter wanted to do a feature on him, the quiet kid who found his voice. Milo declined. He didn't want to be a story about silence. He wanted it to be a story about listening. Instead, he sent a quote. "I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because the world hadn't earned my words yet." The reporter printed that line in the center of the article. Nothing else, no interview, no byline, just the quote and a picture of Milo's hands, holding his book in a beam of light from the bookstore window. It went viral. Astrid Vale shared it on her author page with a caption, "This is why we write. This is who we write for." More letters came. A girl in Vermont wrote, "I never knew someone else read during lunch, too. I thought I was the only one who ate with books instead of people." A boy in Texas sent a drawing of himself sitting under a tree with headphones in and Milo's story in his lap. Now, I'm not just a background kid. I'm the narrator. Milo printed them all, taped them to his wall. They filled the space around his desk like paper ivy. And then, one day, he wrote a new story. It started small. Just a boy, just a bookstore, just a moment at the edge of belonging. But it grew. And this time he didn't stop at 8 pages. He kept going. 30, then 50, then more. He wrote slowly, carefully. He didn't rush to publish, didn't rush to share. He wanted to earn it. Wanted to carry the weight of every quiet reader who didn't yet know how to begin. Years later, when his first full-length novel was released, it came wrapped in a navy blue dust jacket with silver foil letters across the front. The dedication read, "To the ones turned away." The story didn't end there. It started. And beneath that, no signature, just a single line printed in Milo's soft, familiar script, "Still listening." And the readers, they came. They came quietly at first. One by one, letters began to arrive, handwritten envelopes from small towns and big cities, postmarked from places Milo had never seen but had dreamed of in the empty margins of his notebooks. Inside the envelopes were folded papers, photos, drawings, postcards, sometimes even pieces of poems scrawled in the corners. Some were stained with tears. Some were just a single sentence. "Your book is the only one I've ever finished. I read your story out loud to my brother. He doesn't talk, but when I finished, he clapped. I brought your book into class for my reading assignment. Everyone else chose books with dragons or explosions. I chose yours. When I read the line about being the echo when no one else speaks," my teacher cried. They came in brown envelopes and lavender stationery, in notebooks and on receipts. In a shoebox, someone mailed from Alaska with "Please read these when it's quiet," written across the lid. Milo read them all, every one, and he wrote back. Not with long letters, his words still came carefully, but with notes, postcards, lines that stayed. He carried a stack of blank cards in his backpack, writing them in parks, in libraries, at the back of cafes with his headphones in. Sometimes he just wrote, "You were heard," or "I saw your story in mine. Thank you." One reader sent a package. Inside was a battered copy of Milo's first manuscript, the 8-page version. They'd printed it from an old website, stapled it together, and scribbled notes in the margins. Under one line, he carried his silence like a lantern. They had written, "Me too." Milo placed that copy on a small shelf above his desk, next to Astrid's letter, next to a photograph of the bookstore, next to a tiny, folded paper crane someone had mailed with no note, only the words, "Keep folding." And then one day Astrid reached out again. She asked if he'd come with her to a school visit, not to speak, not to read, just to sit with the kids who didn't raise their hands. The ones who drifted toward the corners of classrooms, who flinched when called on, who seemed to shrink from the noise. Milo agreed. They traveled together, quietly, city to city, not on a book tour, on a listening tour. They didn't stand at podiums, they sat in circles. And when the other authors finished their talks and the applause faded, Milo would stay behind, waiting. And always, without fail, a small cluster of kids would hover by the door, books pressed to their chests, notebooks half hidden behind arms. Milo would gesture to a chair beside him. He would offer them a pen, a blank card, and the space to speak if they wanted to. Some wrote single words, others poured out pages. One boy, no older than 10, sat silently for 20 minutes, then slid his card across the table. It read, "I thought stories had to be loud. Yours wasn't. Thank you for proving quiet can still matter." Milo kept that card in his wallet. Years passed. He wrote more. Books about boys with stutters who speak through drawings, about girls who build worlds from old photographs, about libraries where the silence isn't empty, it's waiting. But the bookstore, that one, the first one, stayed with him. Eventually he returned, not for a signing, not even for a reading, just to visit. The manager was different now, younger, nervous when she recognized him. "You don't have to stay long," she said, almost apologetic, "but we did something." She led him to the back, to a shelf tucked beside the window. It had a sign, Milo's Corner. Below it a plaque, in honor of the quiet boy who kept reading anyway. There were beanbags, a table with blank journals, a basket of pens, and a single chair facing the street, where the window fogged on cold mornings and glowed gold at sunset. He sat, watched the sidewalk, watched the door, watched as a child, hood up, eyes low, a book clutched tightly in both hands, stepped inside. The child paused, scanning the shelves, uncertain. Milo stood, walked over, didn't speak, just pointed gently toward the corner. The child's shoulders relaxed. And as they sat in the chair, book open, pencil poised above a blank card, Milo slipped a note into the basket. "You belong here." And then he turned away. Outside, the city moved on, horns honking, buses sighing, lives overlapping. But inside that little store, in that little corner, a quiet boy once turned away had become the reason others stayed, still listening, still writing, still home. Milo never outgrew quiet. He grew into it. It became not a shell but a shape, not a wall but a window. People stopped calling him shy and started calling him thoughtful. But Milo didn't need the word. He just kept writing. He returned to the bookstore every year on the same day, March 14th, the anniversary of the signing that never finished, and also the day he realized a door closing could lead to something wider. The store had changed a little. The display tables shifted, the carpets replaced. But Milo's corner stayed. Kids left him notes in the journal there. "You helped me stop whispering. I brought my brother here. He doesn't read books, but he sat down in your chair. I didn't talk at school for 3 years, but now I write stories. They sound like me." Milo responded in ink, never in person. He wrote in the back pages, "I see you. You don't owe anyone volume. Stories bloom slow, that still bloom." He spoke occasionally at schools now. He never stood on stages. He sat in the library with small groups. Sometimes it was just him and one kid. Sometimes it was him and 20. He'd bring a stack of blank index cards and let them write instead of talk. He'd start each session the same way. "I used to believe stories were for the loudest voice in the room. Then I wrote one, and someone heard it." He never had to say more. By the time he was 30, he'd published 5 novels. None broke records. All stayed in print. They passed from hand to hand in quiet ways, between cousins, on library carts, in classrooms where teachers whispered, "This one's for you." One of his books, The Window Chair, was taught in middle schools now. The dedication simply read, "For the kids turned away, the pages stayed open." Every year, on Astrid Vale's birthday, he sent her a handwritten letter. No email, no phone call, just ink and envelope, and the gratitude of someone who had been changed not by a headline, but by a hand on his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. She never replied, but he didn't mind. He knew she still read them. He'd see it in the interviews where she quoted his lines. In the stories she published, where characters sat in quiet rooms and discovered they weren't alone. Once she was asked by a young journalist, "What's the bravest thing you've ever done as a writer?" She smiled, looked out the window. "I stopped assigning for a boy who never raised his voice, and in doing so, I heard the clearest story I've ever known." Milo read that quote years later in a magazine someone left on a park bench. He cut it out, taped it to the inside of his notebook, and that day he started a new story. No plan, no outline, just a first line. He didn't know the world would change when he opened the book. He only knew the world stopped hurting just a little when he did. He wrote until sunset, then closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf in Milo's corner, and left a note tucked inside. "For whoever needs it next, I promise there's room." Outside, the street was quiet, but somewhere in 1,000 hearts, his words still turned pages, still speaking, still heard, still here. Later that year, during a soft, rainy evening when the bookstore windows blurred with condensation and the smell of paper and vanilla tea filled the air, a girl named Alina stepped through the doors. She was 12, thin-framed, a little hunched from always trying to be smaller. Her hands stayed curled into her sleeves, and her voice, when she used it, was barely more than a breath. She didn't come for a book. She came for the corner. She'd heard about it in school from a classmate who passed her a note in math class. It just said, "Go to the back of Worth and Wren, sit in the chair, leave a line. It'll help." So Alina came. She didn't speak to the cashier, didn't browse the new releases, just walked straight past the main shelves, past the travel section, past the rotating display of author picks, until she reached it. The corner was just as it had been described, tucked beneath the large front window, soft with sunlight even on cloudy days, with a small table and a chair facing outward. On the table sat the journal, the same one people had been writing in for years. The cover had changed, now a patchwork of old book spines, held together by strips of washi tape and stickers from authors who'd stopped by. On the inside front cover, in Milo's handwriting, it still said, "You're already enough. You don't have to say it perfectly." Alina opened the journal, flipped past hundreds of pages, notes from strangers, messages from kids who didn't fit, who weren't heard, who were told they were too quiet, too weird, too something. And then she found the page, one that stopped her breath. It read, "I used to think I was background noise, but someone told me I was melody." It was signed with a little star. Alina pulled a pen from her backpack and wrote underneath it, "I think I'm still tuning, but maybe one day I'll sing." She stayed in the chair for 2 hours, didn't read a word from the shelves. But when she left, she walked differently. Not taller, not louder, just a little more sure that the ground would catch her. 2 weeks later, the staff found a small bundle beneath the table. 3 folded stories on lined paper, tied together with twine. A post-it stuck to the top read, "You helped me start. I'll keep going, I promise." Milo was told about it, of course. He smiled when he heard, didn't ask for the name, didn't need to. He just returned the next day early in the morning before the shop opened and added a new page to the journal. "You don't need to speak to be heard. You just need to leave your truth where someone else might find it." He slid the journal closed, sat in the chair, watched the world wake up through rain-speckled glass. And when the first bell above the door rang, he didn't move. He stayed, still listening, still writing, still waiting for the next quiet story to take its first breath. And it did. One by one, more stories arrived, not with fanfare, but folded quietly into the fabric of the bookstore. In the way children lingered a little longer in Milo's corner, in the way teachers brought whole classrooms by, guiding their students past the shelves and into that small sunlit space like they were leading them to a chapel. In the way parents stood just outside the doorway, watching their kids write, not daring to interrupt. The bookstore owner, a soft-spoken woman named Irene, who'd taken over after the previous manager retired, began collecting the filled journals. She didn't archive them digitally. She didn't try to make them into anything more. She just wrapped each one in linen, tied them with string, and stacked them on the top shelf behind the counter. There were over 30 now. She called them the heart shelf. Every now and then, she'd open one and read a few pages. She never read aloud. She just smiled, then placed it back like someone tucking a child into bed. Milo never stopped visiting. He never stopped writing. By now, his name had appeared on awards lists, book jackets, college reading syllabi. But he never moved out of Meadow Ridge. He never stopped coming to the bookstore. He still walked the same path there on foot, still carried a notebook and a pencil, still ducked his head when someone recognized him. One day in early spring, Irene greeted him as he stepped through the door and handed him an envelope. "No return address," she said, "but it's for you." Inside was a photograph. A girl in a school uniform, standing in front of a microphone. The card beneath it read, "I read my story out loud. I didn't shake as much as I thought I would. My teacher said my voice was clear. I just wanted you to know." Milo sat down at the table in the corner and cried. Quietly. Fully. That evening, he added one final note to the current journal before sliding it onto the heart shelf. "You didn't need me to write your story. You just needed proof someone else had written theirs." In the last light of day, the golden glow fell across the spine of the journal. It lit up the chair, the wall, the old pencil cup filled with more pens than anyone would ever need. And then the light faded, but the story stayed. And in the quiet, Milo turned the page. And in that quiet, another child arrived. This one was small, no older than 9, with a face half hidden behind oversized glasses and a sleeve chewed slightly at the cuff. He hovered by the door before making his way to Milo's corner, steps unsure, fingers clenched around a thin paperback worn at the edges. He didn't look at the shelves, didn't scan the other tables, just made his way straight to the chair, and stood in front of it like someone approaching something sacred. Milo noticed from across the store. He didn't approach. He'd learned long ago that some arrivals didn't need greetings. Some kids needed to find their own way into the silence. The boy finally sat, opened the book in his hands, but didn't read. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from between the pages and laid it gently on the table. Then he reached for the journal and began to write. He took a long time, 20 minutes, maybe more. People passed by. 1 or 2 glanced, curious, but no one disturbed him. When he finished, he tore out the page, folded it carefully, and slipped it inside the back cover of the book he'd brought with him. Then he stood and walked over to the register. Irene looked up, smiled softly. "Would you like to leave that on the shelf?" she asked, gesturing to Milo's corner. The boy shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I want to give it to him." She paused, then nodded, understanding. She walked to the back where Milo had just begun a new story. Handed him the paperback. "He asked for you." Milo took it gently, opened the cover. There, inside, was the boy's name, and the note. "Dear Milo, I didn't think someone like me was supposed to be in books. I didn't know someone like me could write one. I was always the last picked, the last heard. I was never brave. Then I read your story, and I saw myself. So this is my favorite book, but I want you to have it, because now I know I can write my own someday. Jamie." Milo traced the signature with the edge of his thumb. Then he looked up. Jamie stood by the door, hand on the knob, not expecting anything. Milo walked over, handed the book back. "It belongs on your shelf first," he said softly. "Write your name in it like you mean it." Jamie's eyes widened. He nodded, clutched the book to his chest, then turned and slipped back into the golden light outside. Milo returned to his chair, to the journal, and wrote one more line. "The quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. They just wait until the moment feels safe enough to echo." He closed the journal, left the pen, and looked out the window. Somewhere a boy was walking home, knowing for the first time in his life that someone had not only heard him, but answered. And in a corner of a small bookstore in a small town, a story turned one more page. That evening, long after the last customer left and the store dimmed to its soft amber hush, Milo remained in the chair. Not out of habit, but because something about Jamie's visit had reached into a place he hadn't touched in years, a place that still remembered the weight of being small in a room too loud to hold you. He reopened the journal, turned to a blank page, and began writing not a story, but a letter. To the one who hasn't spoken yet, I know the ache of holding words too long. I know how your throat can close around them like they're glass, how you start and stop the same sentence 20 times in your mind and still say nothing. I know how it feels to want so badly to be understood, but not want to make noise doing it. You don't have to rush. You don't have to raise your hand or your voice. Just start with a page, or a line, or one true word, then keep going. Someone is already listening. He signed it simply M. He left the page open, didn't fold it, didn't mark it private, just let it be found because he knew it would be. A week later, a new note appeared underneath. Dear M, I wrote my first story. It's about a girl who builds a lighthouse with her silence. She doesn't warn ships with sound. She just stays lit. I think you'd like her. Love, A. And then another appeared the next day. Dear lighthouse girl, I think I know her. I think I've been her. Thank you for building something instead of waiting for someone to ask. Milo smiled. The journal stayed open. A chain of letters began, never exchanged directly, but always found. People started calling it the thread, not just because it wove them together, but because it reminded them of how all stories start, one pulled word followed by another. The bookstore became more than a bookstore. It became a beginning. Teachers brought students there on field trips not to shop, but to sit in silence and read the thread. Parents came after school, their children leading the way, not to buy anything but to add their own line. The journal was replaced every 3 months now, bound and shelved with the others. The heart shelf had grown to cover the entire back wall, and still Milo returned, still sat in the same chair, still watched as a new kid, nervous, unsure, opened the cover of the journal like opening a door. And still he answered, always softly, always steadily, until one day, long years later, when Milo was older and gray threaded through his hair, he returned to the shop and found a girl sitting in his chair. She was 10, maybe, and her notebook was filled with illustrations of animals that wore glasses and sat in trees reading books. She looked up as he approached. You can sit, she said, scooting over. He smiled. Thanks. I think I'll stand. She held out her notebook. I wrote something. He took it, read it. It was a poem. About a bird who never sang until someone showed her the sky wasn't a cage. When he looked back at her, she asked, Do you write stories too? He smiled. Once, he said, but now I just help others write theirs. She nodded, serious. That's a good job. He watched her return to her drawings, then slowly walked to the shelf, pulled down the first journal, and ran his fingers across the cover. The bookstore buzzed behind him, a soft murmur of pages turning, pencils scratching, voices lifting just enough to be heard. And in that quiet, Milo knew the story hadn't ended. It had only multiplied. 1,000 beginnings, 1,000 lighthouses, still lit, still writing, still here, always. In the last winter of Milo's life, the bookstore windows glowed like soft lanterns against the snow. The streets of Meadow Ridge were hushed, blanketed in white, and the sky hung low and pale, as if holding its breath. Inside Worth and Wren, the warmth of the store wrapped around everyone who entered, coats falling away and voices dropping low, like stepping into sacred space. The corner was just as it had always been. The chair, the journal, the wall of letters, now laminated and framed to protect them from time's tender wear. Children still came, notebooks clutched to their chests, stories stitched into the lining of their sweaters. Some sat for hours, some just ran their fingers across the covers before slipping out again, leaving behind only a new word scribbled into the margins of the thread. Milo came in on Tuesday afternoons, always at the same time. His gait was slower now, but steady, like the pacing of a story that knows exactly how it ends but still enjoys the telling. He brought a new pen each week and sat beside the journal, not to write but to read, to listen. And on one particular Tuesday, near the end of the year, he found a page that stopped him. "Dear whoever keeps answering us, I never knew a bookstore could hold this much heart. I thought places like this were made up in stories. But then my dad brought me here. He used to write. He stopped when my mom left. But last week he wrote again, 2 pages. He left them in the journal. And when he picked me up from school today, he said, 'I think we're both starting again. So thank you for giving him back to me.'" Milo closed the journal and held it against his chest. Then he stood and walked to the shelf. He pulled down one of the earliest notebooks, one with its corners curling, the pages slightly yellowed, and opened to the first line he'd ever written in it. "You don't have to say it perfectly." He whispered it aloud, just once, then sat the book on the windowsill and watched the snow fall. When he passed, quietly, a few months later, the town didn't hold a memorial. They held a reading. The bookstore stayed open for 24 hours straight. Anyone could come. And they did. They read from his books, his letters, his notes in the thread. But mostly, they read their own words. Kids who had once sat in his chair, now grown. Adults who'd found their voice in his margins. Teachers, mothers, poets, students. Strangers who had once become something more just by being heard. Malia came. She brought the copy of the whisper book he'd given her all those years ago, the one with his first signature, shaky and small. She placed it on the corner table, now marked with a brass plaque that simply read, "He waited here for the quiet ones." At dawn, a child wandered in with sleep still in their eyes, holding a notebook filled with stars. They took a seat, opened to a blank page, wrote one word. Still, then another. Here, and at that moment, in that space, under the hush of snow and breath and turning pages, Milo lived again, and he always would. Because Milo's story didn't end with his last breath. It continued in the boy who found a journal on a shelf and whispered his first sentence into the binding like a secret, in the girl who sat in the chair and didn't write anything at all but ran her fingers over the spine of a book and felt for the first time like she might belong. It lived in the quiet moments between sentences, in the blank spaces of margins where courage waited to be scribbled. Worth and Wren became more than a bookstore. It became a refuge. The corner grew, expanding to hold more chairs, more journals. The shelves overflowed with letters, and eventually the back room was converted into what they called the listening library, a place where anyone could come and read through the years of words left behind. No checkouts, no cards, just silence and presence and the echo of hundreds of voices who'd once believed they didn't have one. And at the very center, always, was Milo. His books remained in print, taught in schools, passed down through families. But it was the journals, the ones filled by others, that carried the most weight. No single voice rose above the rest. They spoke together softly in harmony, like wind through trees. One morning, long after the snow had melted and daffodils bloomed against the brick outside, a little girl named Nessa stepped into the shop. She clutched a worn paperback of the window chair to her chest and asked the clerk in a whisper, "Is it okay if I just read today?" The clerk, who had once been one of Milo's students, smiled. "Of course, you can read in the corner." Nessa went to the table, opened the latest journal, and found a message waiting for her. If you're looking for a place to start, this is it." She smiled, wrote her name in the corner, and then, for the very first time, began her story. Not loudly, not all at once, but fully. And somewhere in the stillness, as her pencil met the page, the light from the window caught the brass plaque just right, making it glow. He waited here for the quiet ones. And they had come, and they were writing. And the story would never end. And because the story would never end, the world kept turning pages. Years folded like well-loved corners, gently creased by time. Children who had once tiptoed into Worth and Wren now came back with children of their own. Teachers brought entire classrooms to the shop, not for field trips, but for field quiets. Afternoons set aside not for talking, but for listening, and for writing what couldn't yet be said aloud. Milo's chair was never empty, not for long. It became something of a tradition. You didn't sit in it unless you needed it. Unless your heart was heavy with a story still forming, unless your voice had caught somewhere between ribs and lips. And when you did sit in it, you never sat alone, even when no one stood beside you. Because Milo was there, not in ghost or myth, but in the journal beside the cup of pencils, in the hush that settled when someone finally put pen to paper, in the first word that dared itself onto a blank line. A boy named River once sat there for 2 hours without writing, just holding the journal open, staring at the lined page. When he finally left, he hadn't written a single word. But later that week, a new story appeared on the bookstore's website, submitted anonymously. It was about a boy who couldn't speak, but whose silence carried whole forests inside it. Everyone knew it was him. No one said it. They didn't have to. Years later, on what would have been Milo's 60th birthday, the town of Meadow Ridge unveiled a bronze sculpture, not of him, but of an open notebook. Its pages caught mid-flip as if stirred by wind. It sat at the center of the park, under a maple tree, and each year, children brought poems and left them between the statue's pages, held in place by stones or twine or folded leaves. Some called the sculpture the beginning. Others simply called it M. And once a year, Malia came back to town. She'd place a fresh journal in the corner, write the first entry herself, and every time it ended the same way. If you're holding this book, thank you for writing next. Milo is listening. Somewhere, someone always was, and the world, a little softer for it, kept writing, kept whispering, kept turning pages. Still here, still quiet, still infinite, and in the infinite hush between stories, a child walked through the bookstore doors with rain in their hair and a question in their chest. They didn't speak to the clerk, didn't ask for a title or a genre or a map of where the best books were kept. They went straight to the back, straight to the corner, and paused. The chair waited. The journal was open. The page was blank. They sat slowly, carefully, as though afraid they might break the silence. Then they took a breath, picked up the pen, and wrote, "My name is Leif. I've never said that out loud to anyone but my cat. I don't know if I'm brave yet, but I'm here." They left the pen resting in the spine, stood up, walked out, didn't look back. And an hour later, someone else found that entry and wrote beneath it, "Leif, I see you, and I'm still figuring out what brave looks like, too. Maybe we'll both find it here." The journal stayed open, the chair stayed warm, and somewhere, on porches, in buses, under covers with flashlights, in schools that sometimes felt too bright or too hard, kids read Milo's words for the first time. They didn't all cry, but many of them sighed, the kind of sigh that only happens when something tight inside finally loosens. They picked up pencils, whispered lines into notebooks, built stories out of scraps. And when the words were too much, or too few, or too jagged to speak, they remembered. The corner is still there. The page is still open. The story is still being written. And they, too, still are. Here. And because they were still here, the corner remained alive, not in the way buildings stay alive with light bulbs and locks, but in the way sacred places do, through breath, through memory, through presence. One autumn afternoon, with leaves swirling like laughter around the sidewalk, a class of second graders filed into the bookstore, coats unzipped, voices trailing off into awe. Their teacher, Ms. Lane, led them to the back, where the golden lamp still glowed over the journal. She had once been a quiet child herself, the kind who hovered at the edge of playgrounds, waiting for a pause long enough to enter. She knelt beside the chair. "This, she said, "is where stories begin." The children gathered, wide-eyed. Some sat on the floor, some craned over the table. One boy, elbows on knees, whispered, "Did he really sit here every day?" "He did," Ms. Lane said. "Not to be famous, not to be heard, just to make space for others." A girl named Elsie, with pink glasses and scabbed knees, reached for the pen. She didn't ask permission. She just began to write. "My grandpa forgot my name last week. He has something called old-timers. I wanted to tell him a story so he could remember, but I got nervous, so I'm writing it here." She signed it with a small heart. The boy next to her placed a sticker of a frog beneath it and wrote, "He will remember. Frogs are lucky." Another child added, "Even if he forgets, your story will remember for him." The journal became a quilt that day, stitched by second-grade hands, patched with courage too small to name, but too big to go unnoticed. When Ms. Lane sent the class back to the bus, she lingered. She opened the back page of the journal and added her own entry. "Thank you, Milo. You gave me the words I teach with now." Then she closed the book and walked away, smiling. Outside, wind carried the scent of leaves and ink, and inside, the corner waited. Later that week, an elderly man with shaking hands came in, asking if the store still had a copy of the Whisper book. He said his granddaughter had read it to him last year, and now he wanted to read it back to her. The clerk handed him a copy wrapped in soft brown paper, tied with a ribbon. Inside the front cover, Milo's inscription still read, "To the ones turned away, your page was never blank, just waiting." He clutched it like it was made of something more than paper, and as he left he whispered, "Still listening." The store lights dimmed that night as snow threatened the edges of the windows, but the lamp in the corner stayed on. Always, for the next child, for the next word, for the next whisper turning into a name. And so the story went on, not loud, but forever. And forever was exactly enough, because it meant there was no rush, no deadline, no perfect line needed before someone turned the page, only the quiet certainty that someone would. The lamp in the corner never flickered. Even on nights when the power failed in the rest of the block, it stayed lit. A small battery beneath the table, replaced faithfully by the staff every few weeks, just in case. Children believed it was magic, grown-ups too, in their own quiet ways. Years blurred into soft seasons. Rain gave way to blossoms, blossoms to sun, sun to sweaters. And through it all the stories kept arriving, on torn paper, on crisp journals, on postcards tucked between chapter books. They came from everywhere. Some traveled continents. Some came from across the street. All of them knew the way. On the 50th anniversary of Milo's first published story, the bookstore hosted something they simply called a reading. No posters, no RSVP list, just a date and a time written in chalk on the board out front. Saturday, 5 p.m. Bring your voice. They opened the doors wide that evening. No stage, just the corner and the chair, and a microphone resting quietly in its cradle like a hand waiting to be held. The first person to speak was a woman in her 60s. She held a notebook with frayed edges and said, "Milo's book was the first one I ever stole from the library. I returned it, I promise, but only after I copied every sentence I loved by hand. I was 12. I thought it was a book about a quiet boy. It took me until now to realize it was about me." The second was a boy named Jonah, 11, freckles like paint splatter. He read a poem he'd written the night his parents told him they were moving away from Meadow Ridge. It ended with the line, "I'll find a bookstore just like this one, but if I don't, I'll make one." A teacher spoke, a teenager, a grandfather, and a little girl who didn't read anything, just stood at the mic and hummed a tune that no one recognized but everyone felt. And then, as the sky turned deep violet and the lamp in the corner glowed a little brighter to meet it, the last person stood. A woman with gray-streaked hair, a soft wool scarf, and a notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't introduce herself. She just opened the book and read the last page. It was a letter to Milo. "You told us we didn't need to be loud. We only needed to be true. I think about that every time I sit with a child who hasn't found their words yet. I wait with them. You taught me how. You taught all of us how." She closed the notebook. No applause, just breath. The kind people hold when something sacred passes through the room. Later, long after the shop had emptied and the windows reflected only lamplight and memory, the staff found a note on the table. No name, just ink, carefully written, slipped beneath the journal's back cover. "I was turned away once. Now I turn pages for others. Thank you, Milo. You gave me back my voice." And the lamp, still burning, still waiting, warmed the page like a sunrise. Because even now, even after the story had been told and retold, carried and copied, shared and whispered into being, Milo was there. In every beginning, in every line, still here, still listening, always. And that's how Milo became more than a boy who was once turned away. He became the echo between two quiet voices. The pause before a sentence that takes courage to say. The warmth of a chair that never asked anyone to be different before sitting down. Long after names faded from shelves and covers changed, Milo's name remained not as a signature, but as a feeling. A hush, a soft door left open. A small light in the corner that told you, if you've never been chosen first, you are still meant to be here. And so even now, when the bookstore is quiet, when the snow begins to fall, when another child steps through the door with a story crumpled in their pocket, not yet ready to read, but brave enough to come, the chair is waiting, the lamp is on, the page is blank, and Milo, in every way that matters, is still listening. And somewhere another pencil touches paper. A new child, unknown, unseen just yet, sits cross-legged in the chair beneath the window, journal on their knees, staring at a blank page. Not frightened of it, not rushing it, just letting it breathe with them. Their backpack sits beside the chair, unzipped and spilling out stories scribbled on loose-leaf paper and napkins. They don't know if they'll write today. They don't know if the words will come. But they are here. That's enough. At the front of the shop, someone rings up a purchase. A parent leads a child past the poetry shelf. A dog tied up outside wags its tail at every passing stranger. The world moves, soft and steady. But in the back, at the corner, the world pauses. The child finally writes, "This is my first story." A beat. It's not done. Another beat. But maybe that's okay. They don't sign it. But the handwriting curls like promise. When they slip the journal back into place, they leave behind a sticker in the shape of a moon and a folded drawing of a house with windows shaped like books. That evening, someone else reads it, and underneath they write, "It is okay. I'm still writing mine too." The lamp stays lit through the night. Outside, the stars blink. Inside, the story breathes. Because for every child turned away, for every voice unsure, for every sentence still waiting its ending, Milo's corner waits, not for noise, not for fame, just for someone to arrive, with a page and a pencil and the smallest hope that their voice matters. And it does. Still here. Still open, still becoming, always. And when morning breaks, when the sun tilts through the bookstore windows just right, painting golden lines across the wood floor, there's a hush that falls. the kind of hush that feels sacred. Someone comes in and heads straight for the back, not because they're sure of what they'll say, but because they've heard this is where saying begins. The chair greets them with silence. The journal waits without judgment. They sit, open to a page marked by a ribbon the color of dusk, and read, "Your first story doesn't have to be good, it just has to be yours." They smile, then write, "I've spent a lot of time being someone else's background character. Today, I'd like to try being mine." The pen lifts, the page turns, and just like that, the story continues, not loudly, not all at once, but with the same soft strength that's been echoing from the corner for decades. The staff walks by quietly, setting out new books. Someone places a fresh cup of pencils beside the journal. A child presses a sticker shaped like a star to the window. And through it all, Milo's light glows steady, not because it's being watched, but because someone, somewhere, still needs to know it's okay to begin. So they do, so we do, still here, still writing, still home. And as long as there are pages, they will keep turning. As long as there are children who hesitate before speaking, hands hovering above paper, hearts full of untold things, Milo's Corner will remain. Not as a monument, but as a movement, not as a memory, but as a map. Some say it's just a chair, just a journal, just a quiet table in the back of a small-town bookstore. But those who've been there, who've felt the hush settle around them like a blanket, who've written something they didn't know they were brave enough to say, know better. They know it's a promise. A whisper returned, a kind of sacred, wordless reply that says, you don't have to be loud to matter. You don't have to be perfect to begin. You just have to take your turn. And so they do. They come in with shoes scuffed from playground gravel, with journals hidden beneath jackets, with voices not yet sure if they're wanted. They sit, they write, they add to the thread. And someone else finds their words later, reads them, cries a little, smiles a lot, feels, maybe for the first time in a long time, that they are not alone. Then they write back. This is how the story keeps living. No author at the center, no applause, just pages passed gently from hand to hand, breath to breath, silence to silence, blooming into truth. And always, that little brass plaque by the window, the one so many fingers have brushed without even realizing. It says, he waited here for the quiet ones. Still waiting, still welcoming, still listening. Always. And because the world still needs places like that, still needs corners where the quiet can come alive, where small voices bloom without being forced open, Milo's Corner endures. It endures not in spotlights but in softness, not in headlines but in handwriting. It endures in the way a child walks through the bookstore doors, pauses by the shelf and says nothing at all, but walks straighter when they leave. It endures in the warmth of the chair, worn smooth from thousands of brave beginnings. In the journals, each heavier than the last, not because of ink, but because of meaning. A child once wrote, I don't know if I'm brave, but I'm here. Another replied, being here is the bravest thing. And a third added, we're here with you. No one knew each other's names. They didn't have to. That was the magic of the corner. It didn't ask who you were. It gave you space to become. It didn't rush you to speak. It waited. It didn't require loudness, just truth. And so the story continued. In every quiet page turned, in every pencil picked up, in every sigh released, when someone realized they'd finally found a room that didn't ask them to be louder, just honest. And in the back of the bookstore, where the light always fell just right, the chair remained, still facing the window, still beneath the lamp, still beside the journal. A child sat there today. Maybe it's their first visit. Maybe it's their 10th. Maybe they haven't written a single word, but they will, and when they do, the pages will catch it, gently, like breath, like beginning. And Milo, in every sense that matters, will smile. Because this was always the story, not of a boy turned away, but of the countless who stayed, still here, still writing, still becoming, always. And even now, years beyond the first page, the corner writes itself. Children still arrive without knowing why their feet brought them there, only that something inside them feels heavy and something about this place feels ready to hold it. They sit. Sometimes they stare at the page for hours. Sometimes they write before they even take off their coat. And every time they leave something behind, a sentence, a drawing, a folded poem, a single word circled 3 times. Enough. The staff keeps the journals safe. When one is full, they place it on the heart shelf, then press a blank one into the wooden groove of the table with care. A candle flickers nearby now, next to the lamp, and someone always remembers to light it. Not because it's tradition, but because someone always does. There are stories about the corner now, fictional ones, novels inspired by it. Teachers use it as a metaphor. It's been written into songs, short films, and stage plays. But none of them touch the heart of what it really is. Because you can't stage a silence that listens. You can't design the way a kid sits for the first time and realizes no one will interrupt them here. You can't rehearse the tremble in a pencil when it writes a truth no one's ever heard. Milo would never have called it a legacy. He would have just said, it's a place to land. A soft one, a sure one, a steady one. And so it remains. For the kids with notebooks and fear tucked into their sleeves. For the teens who used to be loud until the world got too cruel. For the grown-ups who come back after decades with trembling hands and say, I used to sit here when I was small. For the very next person who walks through the door and doesn't yet know they're about to begin. Because the corner never ends. It just waits, with a page, with a pen, with a chair that never forgets how to listen. Still here, still open, still turning pages forever. And one day, far into that forever, a child will ask, was Milo even real? And the grown-up beside them, maybe a teacher, maybe a parent, maybe a stranger who wandered in and never left, will smile. They won't answer with a date or a photo or a chapter pulled from a book. They'll walk the child to the corner. They'll show them the lamp still glowing softly, the journals lined up like stitched spines of memory, the latest page still damp with fresh ink, and they'll say, sit. The child will climb into the chair. They'll run their fingers across the wood, feeling the grooves left by years of beginnings. They'll open the journal. They'll read the first line aloud, one written long ago in Milo's own careful handwriting. If your voice feels too small to matter, write it down anyway. The child will be quiet, and then they'll begin. They'll write something clumsy, maybe. Or maybe it'll be the most honest thing they've ever said. They'll close the journal with both hands. And as they rise from the chair a little taller, a little more certain, they won't ask the question again, because they'll know the truth. Milo wasn't just real. Milo is everyone who has ever waited their turn, who has ever whispered instead of shouted, who has ever turned away from a door and still found a page. And his story, quiet, steady, everlasting, is still being written. In every child who comes, in every hand that reaches for the pen, in every voice that stays soft, but shows up anyway. Still here, still listening, still love, always. And so, even after all this time, even after the shelves have been dusted again, after the lamp's bulb has been changed for the 100th time, after the wood of the chair has smoothed from so many quiet hands, Milo's corner remains untouched in the way that matters most. Not frozen, but faithful. Every creak of the floorboard beneath that chair is a lullaby of footsteps past. Every whisper of a page turned is an echo of someone choosing to begin. Every journal, no matter how new, carries the weight of every old story that came before it. And somewhere, as you read this, a child is arriving. They're quiet, maybe unsure, but they see the lamp. They feel the hush. And they know this is a place where the world gets softer, where stories wait without rushing, where silence isn't empty, it's welcome. They take the seat. They pick up the pen. They find the courage that's already been waiting there for them, tucked in the margins. And they write the next line, which means the story of Milo, the story of the boy who stayed quiet, but was never silent, never ended. It only ever turned the page. Still open, still home, forever. And forever is exactly what it needed to be, because some stories aren't meant to be finished. They are meant to be entered, lived in, left open like a door that never closes. On one quiet evening, long after the sky had turned the color of faded paper, a child with trembling hands and a bruised kind of loneliness came through the door of Worth and Wren. They weren't sure what they were looking for, only that they were searching for something that didn't ask too much of them. They found it in the back. They found the corner. They found the journal. They found the lamp, still warm. They found a sentence waiting at the top of a blank page, left behind by the one who came just before. If you're scared, it's okay. I was too. You're in the right place. The child didn't cry, but their shoulders eased. They sat and wrote. Just a few words, a start. The beginning of something that would one day hold someone else. And when they were done, they left the pen in its cup, stood, and looked once more at the brass plaque beneath the window. The letters caught the light. He waited here for the quiet ones, they smiled. Not because they knew who Milo was, but because somehow they already did. And as they walked back into the world, a little taller, a little braver, a little more ready to be exactly who they were, the journal lay open behind them, waiting for the next name, the next voice, the next page. Still here, still turning, still beginning, always. And in that simple truth, always, the corner found its greatest purpose. Not in being remembered, but in being returned to. Not in the name on the plaque, but in the stories that never asked for one. Not in the sound of applause, but in the pause before a word when someone takes a breath and chooses to try. Years from now, long after names have changed and new staff sweep the floors, children will still walk through that bookstore door. They'll still be quiet. They'll still carry too much in their pockets. They'll still hope for something they can't explain. And the corner will be there, as it has always been. The chair, the journal, the light, waiting, inviting, ready, because some stories don't close. They wait for the next whisper, the next beginning. The next brave heart who decides that quiet is not a flaw, it's a form of truth. So when the next hand turns the next page, they'll find not an ending, but a space that says, you are not too late, you are not too small, you are not alone. Write, stay, speak, still here, still open, still yours, always. And because always means always somewhere, right now, a child is curling their fingers around a pen for the very first time, not because anyone told them to, but because something inside them whispered, you can. Their pencil touches paper. Their breath hitches. The first word stumbles, and then the second comes a little easier, and the third, and the fourth, until the page begins to carry the weight that their voice couldn't yet hold. They are not in a rush. No one asks them to hurry, because in the corner there is no clock, only room, only light, only the slow, sacred rhythm of becoming. And when they finish, if they finish, they leave the journal open just as they found it, and beneath their words they write, I was quiet, but I was not alone. And for the one who comes next, who doesn't yet know what they need, only that something has pulled them gently toward this chair, this lamp, this waiting page, they will sit down. They will read that line, and they will begin. Because stories, real stories, the ones that matter, are never truly told. They are shared, hand to hand, heart to heart, page to page, still here, still growing, still holding space for you. Always. And maybe that's the whole story, not in its ending, but in its invitation. A lamp that stays lit, a page that stays open, a chair that never turns anyone away. 1,000 voices written in silence, 1,000 beginnings sparked by one boy who stayed. Milo's corner was never about just one child, it was about all of them. The ones still waiting to be called on, the ones still whispering into their notebooks, the ones who didn't think they mattered, until they saw their words hold space on a page and realized, I exist. And that's enough. So now, even as the world rushes by, even as other stories shout and flash and fade, the corner stays, still, steady, sure. Because somewhere, someone is walking into the bookstore for the first time. Quiet, nervous, hopeful. They'll find the lamp, the journal, the echo of every voice that came before. And they'll write their name. Maybe only that, but maybe that will be everything. And so Milo's story will go on, unfolding gently, forever beginning. Still here, still listening, still love, always. And so, with a whisper and a pencil, the story breathes once more, not with a grand final word, not with a last chapter, because some stories aren't meant to end. They're meant to be lived in, added to, discovered again by hands that tremble and hearts that dare. Somewhere today, a journal is opened. A line is written. A silence is broken. A voice is found. Somewhere, a child reads a sentence that feels like home. And somewhere, someone just like Milo is sitting in the back of a bookstore, knees pulled up, notebook open, breath held, and beginning. Not for applause, not for recognition, and just to say, I'm still here. And they are still here, still writing, still becoming, still forever, always.